Beautiful. Thank you all for coming. And yes, I've called this The Day Jamie Came to Class, and you'll discover why I've called it that as we go. I'll start by introducing myself, and it's actually relevant to the presentation why I want to do that. I'm a lecturer in social work and human services at QUT. I'm a pracademic, so I come not through an academic course route. I come through a practice route. I worked with homeless young people for almost 20 years across Australia in different cities. Homeless and really highly marginalised young people, and that really is part of who I am. You know, that I'm actually not a social worker. I'm not eligible for membership of the Australian Association of Social Workers, but they let me teach them, so that's good. But I'm a youth worker. As part of that youth work that I've done, I've advocated in all kinds of forums for more inclusive services for LGBTIQ plus young people who find themselves often excluded from services. Young people working in the homeless sphere, young people who come out to their families, often have extremely bad reactions and find themselves homeless, and that's a really unsafe place for them to be. But then they front up to a service and they don't get a good response from the service because they don't understand what the issues might be. 18 years ago, I helped to establish Open Doors Youth Service, which is still the only government-funded youth service for LGBTIQ plus young people in all of Queensland. So not just Brisbane, which would be bad enough, but all of Queensland. And I'm really proud of my role in establishing that service. I'm also really sad that it's the only one. I also identify as a lesbian. That's a core part of who I am, and I identify as queer. And I found it really interesting, Jenna, what you were saying about the highly regulated social work sector, and that in 1988 you couldn't even mention, that couldn't be part of your practice. I started working in the early 1980s and was out. I've always been out as a practitioner, and always. That's just been part of my practice, is that I've been out and therefore allowed the young people that I've been working with to talk about that and find me as a safe place that they can be working through some of that stuff. So I find that really interesting that at the same period there wasn't even a question, yeah. So that's me. Janet already very kindly introduced what social work is, so I don't really need to talk much more about this. It's a values-based profession, and you talked about some of the really tricky values that come into play. What we talk about in Australia, we talk about establishment practice and critical social work practice. I think you talked about liberal and radical, or I can't remember, but anyway, basically social work has this tension where we help people try and live with or survive through the inequities that they're experiencing, and at the same time we try and redress those inequities. So we're doing this juggle the whole time, where we help people fit in, but we acknowledge that the system that we're trying to fit them into is broken. And in my work with young people, that I saw that all the time, particularly in education and stuff like that. The global definition of social work talks about principles of social justice and human rights and respect for diversity. Australia's peak social work body, the Australian Association of Social Workers, talks about social justice. talks about respect, advocates non-discriminatory practice, and, you know, particularly against a person on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity. So social work is quite clear about where it sits in relation to work with LGBTIQ plus people, but we do it badly. So I teach my students, I teach first year, I teach a couple of years, but I teach first year, and you know, and you know, talk to my students about values and about how do you have these espoused values, and how do you practice them? How do you actually operationalise them? You know, how do you operationalise social justice? You know, how do you actually do it? And I think as a profession, we're struggling with that too. We can say, oh, we agree with social justice and respect and all that kind of stuff, but we don't actually practice it particularly well. And so that's, and in education, in social work education, I think we don't do it particularly well either. So there's a bit of a gap, isn't there, between the two. What was I going to say? No, can't remember. So social work education. That's what I was going to say. We're not regulated. Like you were talking about. We have an accrediting body. The AASW is the accrediting body, but people can't get struck off. You know, so and social work education, social work courses have to be accredited by the AASW. So we have to still be teaching the certain, you know, curriculum. So we can't go off field. We're accredited every 5 years. We have to go through this long accreditation process, but we're not regulated in the same way that you were describing. So the accreditation standards, education and accreditation standards, say that social work programs promote sensitivity to and incorporate content on culture, ethnicity, race, gender, sexual orientation, but actually. Social work with LGBTIQ people and communities is a really marginalised area of practice and research and teaching. We don't actually see much research produced, and when it is, it's it might be a chapter in a book that talks about the problems that LGBTIQ plus people experience, and so McKinnon talks about the melancholy other that walks through the pages of a social work text, you know, and so that's how it's talked about. It focuses on stigma. It focuses on inequality. It doesn't focus on the systemic causes of the issues that LGBTIQ plus people experience. Also, heterosexuality remains unexamined. Gender remains unexamined in social work education. And so while we say we try and teach anti-oppressive practice, we're actually really complicit in silencing and invisibilising and therefore oppressing. So, there hasn't been any research in Australia about the experiences of queer social work students, but a number of North American studies have found that despite the espoused commitment, social work students don't experience the classroom or the content as safe or inclusive. One study that was done across all social work universities in North America and Canada, of the 1,018 queer social work students surveyed, 1/3 of them experienced homophobia in their social work programs. 1/3. Like, that's huge, yeah? And a fifth felt that faculty behaved and spoke in ways that reflected their own homophobia and bias. So with their student colleagues and with faculty, they're experiencing this invisibility, this lack of safety. The reality is it's the responsibility of teaching staff to create a culture in the classroom that's safe, that's inclusive, that's affirming. And when academics either haven't thought about it, which is often the case, it's not, it's that privileged kind of, I don't even need to think about it, so therefore I don't even need to think about whether I need to teach it. Oh, they're okay, or worse, actively coming from a place of homophobic views, then social work students who are queer don't experience the classroom as safe, don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum. And then they struggle with how do they integrate their social work self with their queer self. And there's some interesting research in America that talked about that struggle, and so is it okay to be out when I'm on placement, or in practice? What happens if I come out? So looking at those intersections between being queer and being a social worker are challenging. And when the university doesn't give them any guidance about how to do that, then those challenges become personal ones. They have to try and navigate that themselves. And the reality is they've done that already at high school. In Australia, there's some big research that's been done, the Writing Themselves In report, that really clearly says, in the 3 versions of that report that were done over a number of years, that school is the most unsafe place for LGBTIQ young people. Family is the next most unsafe place, physically and emotionally. So the 2 places that young people spend most of their time in, school and family, are the 2 most unsafe places for them. So partly students might think that they could expect better at university. Things will be different. I'm at uni, I can come out, I can be safe. And they're finding out that they're not. And as I was saying earlier, students should expect better in social work courses, and so they should feel like they can be out in a social work course which espouses social justice, respect, human dignity, and they discover that that's not the case. So, who's Jamie? So, I teach a youth work unit, and my teaching strategy in that is what I call a soap opera approach to case studies. Case studies are like the heart and soul of social work education. People do case studies all the time, and I do this soap opera case study where it's an ongoing case study, and over 8 weeks, something different happens every week to this young person. And so my reason for doing that is that students get a sense that issues compound. That if they're homeless, that might have an impact on their education. Yeah, if they have a fight with their parents, that might have an impact on other aspects of their life. Because the usual case study is just a one-off case study. You deal with it, you move on to the next case study, which is how work happens in this neoliberal managerialist environment. But, what I want to teach students, the journey that they go on, is that issues are really complex and they compound. You can't just think about one thing. And so that's why I do this soap opera approach. And what happens is that over that 8 weeks, students start to kind of care about that young person a bit too. They have an experience of being that young person's worker a bit. And students have actually said, I was driving through, because I located in a suburb, they live in an actual suburb. I was driving through Strathpine and I thought I saw Jamie. It's like, no, hang on, Jamie's not real, but this is how engaged they get with this process. So anyway, so Jamie's a fictional case study ongoing over 8 weeks. And so one of the fictional young people that one of the tutorial groups get is a 14-year-old male to female transgender young person. And the case study is written drawing on the real-life experiences of transgender and gender-diverse young people that I've worked with and that Open Doors has worked with. And so, drawing on those experiences, Jamie, experiences family arguments and homelessness and violence and discrimination and self-harm and, all this stuff, big challenging stuff to deal with. But Jamie also uncovers a real resilience, a real strength. And in doing that, Jamie challenges all of us to kind of reframe our ideas about gender diverse young people being victims, and gender diverse young people really kind of struggling with identity crisis, because that's part of the construction of young people. Is that young people this is a time of identity crisis. If we draw on psychological kind of constructions of young people, thank you Erickson. Young people. This is an identity crisis time. Like, we don't all have identity crises throughout our whole life. It's a gift that Erickson gave young people. And what Jamie teaches us is that actually Jamie's very clear about their identity all the way through. The crises are actually created by people and systems that don't accept or acknowledge the identity that Jamie is presenting with. And so students have to work through that process as well, My rationale for presenting Jamie to students is deeply embedded in my prior work with LGBTIQ young people, and my hope to try and create a body of graduates who are more competent and more confident in going out and being better workers with queer young people. I kind of have a position that my lecturing work is actually a paying it forward to all of the young people that have given me all of their stories and all of their journeys, and it's a real honour and a privilege to work with young people, but any people in a social work context, and so my being a lecturer is a real paying it forward, and so this takes that to that LGBTIQ space. It's also a response to the fact that we don't teach anything in the curriculum. So I at least go, I'm flying the rainbow flag and we're doing this. We're talking about Jamie for a semester. We're going to do that. I've been teaching this Jamie process for a number of years. So there's actually a community of graduates who have worked with Jamie. And so students go on placement and a graduate's their supervisor, and the graduate says, oh, are you doing SWB 207? Oh, have you got Jamie? And so there's this, community of people who are still talking about Jamie. So let me just talk about the notion of critical reflection. So critical reflection's core to social work practice, good social work practice, critical social work practice. It's different to reflection. Reflection is that reflecting on what you've done, or and trying to think about what you could have done better, what you can learn from it, what you could have done better. The critical aspect of critical reflection is about thinking about dominant discourse, thinking about how dominant discourses shape the way you responded to that particular incident. So it tries to identify and challenge inconsistencies between your espoused theory and your practice. It questions. It calls on you to identify and challenge implicit assumptions and modernist notions of power and identity, and looking at binary constructions. Yeah, so it's work. Yeah, critical reflection is work. And that's what I'm presenting today is work. But the other thing, and I should have said this at the beginning, is that the critical reflection isn't done just by one person. Critical reflection's done by peers as well. So I invite you to engage in my critical reflection process and talk to me about what I've missed. Talk to me about what assumptions I haven't picked up. Yeah, what ways that I might have not yet deconstructed this incident that I'm going to present you with, and how I might reshape and reframe that. The other thing that I meant to say right at the beginning too is I invite you all to cough a lot during my presentation, because that's what I've done through all of yours. Feel free, you know. Okay, so critical reflection. My critical incident, I'm going to read I'm going to read this out. So this is the day that Jamie came to class. So in 2018, I started the Jamie tutorial process like I usually do, asking students to nominate a week in which to facilitate the group discussion, and then introducing them to the first instalment of the story, so introducing them to Jamie. The discussions each week progressed just as usual until 3 weeks in, when a student whose turn it was to facilitate the discussion, which that week focused on Jamie's experiences at school, disclosed that they had shared many similar life experiences to Jamie. The student identified as gender diverse, and in the discussion they talked about their own experiences at school, their experiences of family breakdown, of homelessness, of sex work, of drug use and mental health issues. So they spilled a lot. Yeah. In previous years, students had come to me and talked about some of those similar life experiences that they might have had to the Jamie story, but they hadn't actually talked about them in class. What happened, that disclosure changed everything for the group. Suddenly Jamie was there. Jamie was in the room. Jamie had come to class, yeah? So suddenly all the things that they might want to ask Jamie, because that's something that always, if Jamie was here, we'd be able to ask them, blah, blah, blah. And suddenly Jamie was there. What was an abstract, if interesting and sometimes challenging discussion, became real. But for that student, they found that their life was being assessed. Their decisions were being discussed, and ultimately they felt potentially judged. A few weeks in, they decided that they came and saw me and told me that they weren't going to keep coming to the tutorial, that it wasn't a safe place for them anymore. We negotiated a different assessment because the tutorial participation was part of that assessment. And so to continue the story, I guess, so the student who became Jamie found that their capacity to perform in the student role, to be a learner, to question ideas, to challenge their own values and those in the group, challenge the ideas that are being presented in the story, were disrupted because they were put in the position of performing as Jamie. And performing as Jamie often in a victim role. So where they had worked through a whole heap of stuff to be at university, to emerge at university as this person that they are, and they were thrown right back into this agonisingly difficult time when they were at school and family breakdown and all of the stuff that they talked about. The student felt pressure to respond, feeling a responsibility to correct information, to represent gender diverse or trans people. The thing was that the student made a choice, and this is what I've struggled with a bit, is the student made a choice to disclose that. There was no expectation that they would, and I still don't know why they chose to do that. For me, as someone who is queer identified but cisgendered, I welcomed the view of someone who identified as gender diverse and who was apparently willing to share their experiences. So in some ways I ceded my authority and my expertise without ever negotiating with them about their own safety in that process. Kind of a bit cheekily, I don't mind causing some discomfort to middle-class cisgendered white girls who are the majority of the class. That's really why I present the whole Jamie thing, is to cause them some discomfort, to challenge. But putting someone in harm's way, and I feel very protective over queer young people, and this is part of what I need to critically reflect on myself too, is my feeling protective, and what that can mean. But it made me feel like I'd let this person down and therefore all queer young people down. And my intent had been the opposite. My intent had been to make visible stories that are invisible, to help students understand young people who are misunderstood, and to queer the curriculum a little bit, just a little bit. And I trusted my capacity to keep the experience challenging but safe. And I failed in that process for this student. And the other thing that happened was the disclosure had the effect, I observed that it limited other students' safety or capacity to share problematic views, which, reflecting back on the discussions we were having before, part of a student's journey is to actually work through some problematic views and hopefully change them. And so they were kind of a bit silenced in that process too, where they modified their questions. They allowed that student to take over the discussion, and I noticed a real difference when the student wasn't in the tutorial group, that other students were more free to speak up, and they might have expressed their uncertainty, talked about their own value challenges, talking about their concerns that they might have had to respond, and they'd felt less free to do that when Jamie was in the room, even though they were also excited about Jamie being in the room. So my critical reflection, if we go through that deconstruction process and think about some of the assumptions that I was unwittingly or whatever drawing on, my intention was always to educate and inform, assuming a middle class, generally young, female, cisgendered audience, which is the typical profile of the Australian social work student. And my intent was to challenge them to think differently, so they might become more competent and more confident if ever they came across a young person like Jamie. I assumed that I could facilitate a safe, if challenging, learning environment. I assumed that the student who chose to disclose was also then happy to respond to questions, So there was an assumption that they held knowledge and were willing to share it, which is an assumption that we can make often about queer students, when they fly the rainbow flag, and we can hand them, well, you can talk about that, you're the expert, and we give them that authority without ever really checking with them. Obviously, as a lecturer, I'm in a position of power, but in this process, I try and take a back step, so the students who are facilitating the discussion, who are leading the discussion, actually take on the facilitation role. So I actually make a point of not stepping in during that process, and so I didn't step in while this student was disclosing. I checked in with them afterwards, obviously. I should say that very clearly. I did keep on checking in with them. The other, part of the kind of things that part of deconstruction process is thinking about identity and And so I do draw on my identity as an insider and an expert, you know, with all the limits, you know, that is too, that has too. So as, you know, as queer identifying as also someone with a long work history, working with and advocating for queer young people, you know, I come from that place, but I also recognise the limits of that. And that can simultaneously silence, but also open up places for conversation. And so that identity that I put forward can have a dual effect, and I'm aware of that. My identity as the creator of Jamie means that I have ideas about who Jamie is. As I write the story, I have a picture in my head about who Jamie is, you know, and how they might respond. And what I love about this process is that every year students come up with new interpretations that I haven't thought of. And I go, God, I never thought, like, I wrote Jamie and I never thought of that, you know, and that's really exciting for me. So I guess, you know, part of that is that not just for students, but for me too, Jamie came to class that day. And so, you know, on one hand, I kind of welcomed that opportunity to have someone who was willing to voice an opinion, but I also put them in the role of authority, someone who could speak on behalf of all queer culture, you know, and I got to step aside from being the only expert in the room. You know, I got to share that space, and like I said, I didn't negotiate with them about that. I didn't negotiate their safety in that process. I let it happen, yeah? So, the reconstruction process is that, what do I do that's different, yeah? How, having thought about this, how do I make this different, yeah? And so, thinking about, you know, the stuff that we know, yeah, that identity is fluid, that students come to class with intersecting identities, that sometimes they'll bring aspects of those identities forward, sometimes they'll keep those identities hidden. It's their choice, you know, and they need to have the choice to do that. What I'm thinking is that, you know, is that inviting students to actually do a deeper level reflection about how their own experiences intersect with Jamie's, not just as being queer, but, you know, experiences of being bullied at school or having fights with their parents, you know, so looking at those kind of common grounds, you know, so Jamie being a human story, not just a queer story. Engaging in more discussion early about essentialising identities, you know, that students can actually only represent their own identity, their own experiences, and so a student can't be the spokesperson for all queer people, you know, that's actually impossible, and that no student or lecturer can really expect them to do that. So therefore, that student came to class. Jamie didn't come to class. That student came to class, yeah, with all of their experiences that were similar to Jamie's, but it wasn't Jamie, it was that student, yeah. Also, kind of letting myself off the hook a little bit as part of that deconstruction process, you know, and that I do aim to create a safe learning space, and I can challenge some of the overt risks that might occur in that space. I can offer support, but at the end of the day, students have agency in regard to their own safety, and so I have to let myself off the hook a little bit, you know. The process of critical reflection is meant to be provocative and challenging and potentially transformative, and for lots of people it is. But as part of that process, what happened for this person was that the constant reflecting, the requirement to keep a journal, the constant coming back to this difficult, traumatic space actually wasn't challenging and transformative. It was traumatic and damaging to them. It actually threw them back into a space where they actually needed to do some healing from. and so I need to remain alert to that, to where those students might be sitting, So that's my deconstruction and reconstruction process from Jamie. And so I invite you, what have I forgotten? What have I missed? What could I think about differently that will make this happen differently? Yeah?
Maybe not specifically to how you would have changed, but I'm just curious to the choice of, did you ever consider adding the racial element to Jamie, to have that intersectional aspect? Because a lot of this is engaging in anti-oppressive pedagogy, but missing the racialized part. For example, here as a transgender person, but perhaps transgender person of color. That's another element to think about that often is left behind, right?
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering.
That's
the first thing that came to mind.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I have three case studies that I run, and so in 3 different tutorial groups. So one is to unaccompanied minor refugees from Afghanistan, and so students need to navigate that kind of stuff. And the other is an Aboriginal young family who live in outback Queensland, and so they have to negotiate lack of referral resources and options, but none of those are intersectional. Yeah? So I thank you. Yeah, I may well make Jamie, I'll think about that. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, yeah.